When I wrote the last pages of my book announcing the end of woke, I must say I was a bit scared of being too optimistic. Well, a few weeks ago, you might have heard of that, Peter Boghossian and Christopher Rufo bet $1,000 that the Democrats in America will reject Wokism. This came as a relief for me. Peter Boghossian thinks it will happen within 6 months, whilst Rufo reckons it might take a little longer, but both fight fiercely Wokism, and I can tell you they know their business. Peter Boghossian is a precursor of the anti-woke movement. Rufo can fairly be nominated commander-in-chief, especially in the last weeks. We'll talk about it. So both they fiercely fight Wokism. They only disagree on one thing, which is the timeline. So here's the good news. From now on, the question isn't if, but when, and this is a big step forward.
But then maybe before we go into examples from your book that would prove the point that this is coming to an end, can we define woke? Can we go back to its origins and dig deeper, and also the members of our audience that might not be familiar with the issue because it hasn't started properly in the country or it's not at such a speed developing. Can we go back to the origins, please?
Yes, it's interesting to go back to the beginning of woke, because the word woke itself is controversial. It is linked originally to the segregation era in America. Black citizens were told to stay woke, in quotes, which meant to stay alert because they could suffer from social injustice or racial discrimination. Well, this was before the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Then the word had a second life in the 21st century in America. In 2014, the BLM movement, Black Lives Matter, launched the hashtag Stay Woke and promised to fight for the black minorities' rights. Then the word expanded to other minorities, sexual and ethnic minorities, and became very fashionable. But as soon as Wokism came under criticism, the same that had embraced the word woke rejected it all of a sudden. So they said, even woke activists started saying, you know, Wokism doesn't exist, cancel culture doesn't exist, it's all pure invention, and it is a word that is being weaponized by right-wing activists in order to silence social justice warrior. Well, all this to say that, you know, this word that was first embraced by I want to be clear on this. Wokeism exists. I spent 4 years writing about that, so I'm convinced that it exists, and it is a very, very useful 6 letters word that embraces a number of doctrines, 4 of them I would say: anti-racism, neo-feminism, transgenderism, and the decolonized movement. And all those doctrines envisage all human relations via the spectrum of power struggle. You know, like the blacks are oppressed by the whites, women are oppressed by men, transgender are marginalized by cisgender, ethnic minorities are being marginalized by the ex-colonizer. This is the way they see the world.
So, in your book, you say that woke is coming to its end. It's like coming out of fashion, or you might say it's not as popular, or people start to have doubts about the idea standing behind it. But what kind of examples can you give us that actually this fight is successful?
Well, Anitzka, talking about negative connotation would be a euphemism these days. Over the last weeks, Wokism was described as the rot destroying American Ivy League universities. The American elite factory is crumbling before the world's eyes. What's going on right now, I must say, is absolutely spectacular, what's going on in American higher education. Following the Hamas savagery in Israel on October the 7th, students and teachers justified the atrocities as, quote, acts of resistance. Israel, being the face of the West white world, was guilty at the very moment it was enduring mass killings and tortures of its civilians. Demonstrations on campuses were followed by acts of harassment toward Jewish students. All in all, overt antisemitism was in display. So much so that on December the 5th, the US Congress held a hearing titled Holding Campus Leaders Accountable and Confronting Antisemitism, where the presidents of Harvard, the MIT, and Penn University testified. And when asked if calling for the genocide of Jews violated their university's code of conduct, the three women calmly answered the now infamous statement, "It depends on the context." Interestingly, the hearing became the most viewed testimony in the history of the US Congress, more than the Watergate or it was incredible. Well, because it's all filmed and now we have social media, of course. It caused the resignation of Penn's president and sparked extensive criticism of Harvard's president Claudine Gay, the first Harvard black president. She was accused of plagiarism. She was held responsible for a culture of censorship. In effect, Harvard is ranked as the worst college in America for free speech. Claudine Gay was also criticized for holding a thin publication record, having published only 11 papers and no books. It also came up that she had actively sidelined black colleagues who didn't adhere to the diversity mantra. So on January the 2nd, Claudine Gay finally resigned. But the story goes beyond the Claudine Gay case. It reveals how much woke has she was sounding the alarm about the paradoxical observation, the collapse of knowledge in higher education. Paradoxical and sad and quite worrying observation, I would say. But that's what we're seeing now. I mean, Harvard is the jewel of American higher education, and we're learning worse things every day about that university. So the latest events in academia have precipitated the fall of the D.E.I woke trinity. Everybody is probably now familiar with the acronym D.E.I, standing for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Over the last 2 decades, D.E.I departments have become obese bureaucracies, overseeing what can be said on campuses, dictating things like hiring, career promotion, and research funding, and elevating race and identity politics above merit. The corruption caused by DEI is now on full display, and many voices now call for the disempowering of DEI as well as an objective, data-driven review of DEI policies. It seems to me that in a way, wokeness has left the cultural battlefield and is now under serious scrutiny, meaning that from now on, the fight against woke isn't left to commentators, dissidents, or isolated heretics what is at play is not only an intellectual rebuttal, but also an institutional response to woke.
But originally, all of that was introduced to fight the systemic racism, the discrimination. But was there any proof given for that, or was it just introduced through the back door? And now with the fight back, how does the fight back looks like in the courts? Which groups are actually on the forefront of that fight back within the institutions?
Well, you mentioned the fact that Wokism refers to systemic racism. I would rather talk about systemic Wokism, because wokeness has infiltrated education, the media, and the economy. And that's why we're seeing a salutary institutional and legal response to Wokism. One of the major responses came last June, in June 2023, and it was the historic decision of the Supreme Court of the United States that struck down affirmative action in college admissions. On that occasion, a very straightforward principle was reiterated, which says eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it. I think it cannot be clearer than that. Another judicial response to wokeness comes from the detransitioners. Who are the detransitioners? They are those young adults who were once diagnosed for gender dysphoria and went through medical gender transition, but now regret doing so because they underwent irreversible surgeries and hormone treatments. More and more of them now sue their doctors and their clinics for medical negligence.
And that was the very early age, right? That wasn't
Well,
like full-on adults. I
Yes,
think that's worth
well,
mentioning that these were children.
Exactly. Well, most of them, because you have puberty blockers that you give to very young children, after which you give cross hormones, which means testosterone to women and estrogen to men. And so you have, there was this, in Great Britain in December 2020, there was the seminal Bell versus Tavistock trial. I don't know if you remember that, it was before the High Court, and it was this young woman who decided to sue the NHS. It had huge repercussion, among which the closing of the GIDS, which is Gender Identity Development Service, which was the world's first gender clinic for minors. And we're seeing now more and more legal actions taken by detransitioners in the US. Well, mostly young women who now have to endure lifelong changes to their bodies, a deep voice, a beard, compromised sexual function, and probably infertility. And now even the gender doctors start to say that and to recognize that those can be the consequences of what they call gender affirmation, which you were mentioning language previously, and I think this word affirmation is interesting. It shows how much the language is twisted by wokeness, because gender affirmation means negation of your biological sex. Affirmative action, which is a positive discrimination, means excluding people in order to put other people in. So you see, it's very telling of the way wokeness uses the language. Anyway, to go back to the detransitioners, one example of them recently was Lila Jane. She was one of those who's suing, and she was given puberty blockers at very young age, followed by injections of testosterone, and had a mastectomy at just 13 years old. So I think the judicial pressure on gender medicine is now rising. Sign of the times, a huge insurance company for doctors in Australia, sorry, I never look at it, declared last summer that they won't cover practitioners facing a claim if they've prescribed gender-affirming hormones to patients under 18. So you see, c'est le nerf de la guerre. I don't know how you say it. Le nerf de la guerre.
The nerve of the war.
Yeah, money is the nerve of the war, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
So a medical scandal is unfolding, and it seems more and more obvious that gender ideology is the last straw that will trigger the end of woke, I think. Well, I say the last straw, maybe it's not the right word, because genderism is heavier and wider issue than a straw. But I think this is really the claim that will announce the end of woke.
And so you are a French writer, you wrote this book in French, but then this is about the counter-offensive in the Anglosphere. Why is that, and what is happening with woke in France?
Well, regarding Wokism, the Anglosphere is ahead of us. Everything that happens in the US then happens in the UK and then reaches continental Europe. Thus, watching what's happening in the US and the UK is a way for us to read the future. Believe it or not, Agnieszka, it's exactly what you said before. Living in London since 2011 made me a fortune teller for my French compatriots. It allows us to see how far Wokism can go. For example, who would have thought that wording the definition of a woman would become subversive? But above all, observing Wokism in the Anglosphere is extremely helpful because they've had the time to understand what's going on and to elaborate tools, weapons, and methods to fight it. Indeed, that's exactly the core idea of my book. It was to document all those tools and weapons and methods. I thought there were already various essays analyzing the woke madness, so I chose to document the pushback. Expression, equality before the law, equality of opportunity, pluralism, and the value of objective truth, all bedrock principles of our liberal democracies. And maybe there's another point worth mentioning here. You were talking about virus previously also. Wokism started earlier in the Anglosphere, thus the contagion into continental Europe is kind of a second wave of the virus. And now we know that the second wave is always less virulent. Basically, why is it less virulent? Because of internal conflicts. I'll explain. The woke umbrella seeks to protect a variety of minority groups. But guess what? Those groups don't agree on everything. They don't have exactly the same claims. They don't think the same way. Worse than that, the rights of the ones are incompatible with the rights of the others. Transgender hate feminists. Both groups can't agree on the definition of a woman. Feminists think what defines a woman is XX sexual chromosomes. Trans think you only need to identify as a woman to be one. So you can choose which team you're on, but it doesn't go well together. Gays disagree with the trans activists who redefine homosexuality. It's not anymore the attraction between the same sex, but the attraction between same gender. So they're not very happy with that. And even within minorities, there are brawls going on. For example, decolonial feminists see white feminists as a dreadful imperialist bunch of bigots. So for all those reasons, Wokism now reaching our coasts is a bit weakened.
Mm-hmm. But can you give examples of the tools, the methods to fight back? Because obviously this is a core purpose of the book, to give a kind of like a manual almost by documenting the fight in Anglosphere.
Yeah, you want the guide, you want to start the resistance, maybe.
I already contributed to the resistance in Britain, contributing money towards free speech union being established.
All right.
Yes,
Important tool.
but I think for
Huge
our
tool.
audience, it's important to discover examples.
Huge tool there, the Free Speech Union that was launched in 2020, but I'll come to that. But I spent 4 years meeting these brainy people who crafted different kinds of strategies, all put in place in order to spare us from an Orwellian world. So I cannot mention all the initiatives, but
just few examples.
Yeah, I can give a few principles that came out of that study. And I thought I can illustrate those principles with a few examples from my book. So the first principle is that to combat wokeness, you need to inform people. Mainstream media have always been very shy in their reporting of the ravages of Wokism. And as we know, woke activists' favorite response to criticism consists of saying that Wokism doesn't exist. So you're told to sleep soundly, but the next morning, as you start your day, Wokism is enshrined in law. A guy called Christopher Rufo understood this. He's the same Rufo that I was talking in the beginning about the bet. He's a key figure of the anti-woke battalion. He's 39-year-old, best known for his investigative journalism, and recently the author of a book called America's Counter-Revolution. Rufo's activism started when a municipal employee of Seattle sent him the content of an anti-bias training carved for white civil servants only. The title of the training was Internalized Racial Superiority for White People. Says it all. Rufo publicized the content of that training, and he soon disclosed how critical race theory had pervaded all US federal administrations, from the Treasury Department to the FBI. Critical race theory, or CRT, another acronym. Authoritarians, they love acronyms. So CRT is the name for the third way anti-racism. Rufo was interviewed in the media. He wrote abundantly in the press, exposing how a new segregation was slowly embedding itself in public bodies, schools, and corporations. And his strategy relies on 3 stages, a plan in 3 stages. First, inform by, you wanted the method? I'll give it to you. First, inform by unveiling what's really happening, and rely on a robust media coverage in order to mobilize popular support. Secondly, Wokism becomes an electoral campaign issue. This way, politicians take hold of the matter. Thirdly, Rufo works with lawyers who provide politicians with the judicial tools to dislodge Wokism from institutions. The strategy against CRT, critical race theory, is then replicated regarding transgender ideology. Tens of American states have now passed legislation related to the way CRT or trans ideology is taught in schools, as well as legislations about gender-affirming medicine. Sorry. Another rule that stands out is that when you face cancel culture, you can't fight on your own. Wokism, because it is intellectually unsound, relies on intimidation to impose its worldview. People live in fear if they step out of line, that they will be mobbed on social media and may end up losing their job. Considering the enemies of free speech hunt in packs, its defenders need to band together. And that's why 𝐿𝐲𝐿, that you were mentioning, launched this Free Speech Union in 2020. So it's a membership organization, and it rescues people attacked for wrong thought, and it's very, very efficient because people are in effect attacked for wrong speak or wrong opinions, and they are being licenciés,
losing their job.
Yeah, losing their
Sometimes
jobs.
even asking questions.
Sacked.
Yeah, sacked, and they are being sacked for that. And the Free Speech Union comes to their rescue. They come to their defense on social media, on mainstream media. They organize petitions in their favor. They write to their employers, because usually their employers want to sack them because they don't want scandal. But if you make scandal in the press about the fact that they've sacked someone, then they'll think twice.
But they also provide the legal support, right?
They also provide legal assistance. There was, I think 2 days ago, the Free Speech Union announced that an employer in a bank had just won £800,000 because he was fired for wrong thought. And anyway, the Free Speech Union has now branches in South Africa, in New Zealand, and in Australia, and it shows that it was needed. A third commandment that emerges is the following: if you want to resist wokeism, you mustn't repeat things you don't believe in. That's the best rampart to wokeism, I think, and that can be done by anyone. J.K. Rowling, author of Harry Potter, showed an outstanding tenacity in this exercise. What does Rowling believe, and what does she refuse to say? Well, she says a woman is an adult human female. She holds that this sentence is not transphobic. She claims that sex is a biological fact and argues there are only 2 of these. And that's how she became the target of a vile campaign whereby trans activists threatened to rape her, kill her, called for a boycott of her books. Rowling's persistence to speak out despite the ceaseless abuse she receives, the way she clings to her principles, for sure has been a source of inspiration for millions. I'm talking about this fight between transgender and feminists, but all transgender don't think like the fiercest activists. Of course, some transgender don't agree with that fight. I want you to say. Another lesson that came out from the Counteroffensive Chronicle is that once you dare confront wokeism with method and determination, it doesn't hold long. The fight seems an uphill battle at first, but those who roll up their sleeves to confront the thought police are often surprised by the lack of arguments on the opposite bench. Canada, known as the world's wokest country, provided an interesting tale. In 2017, the Law Society of Ontario introduced a mandatory statement of principles. All lawyers and paralegals were required to sign a statement acknowledging their obligation to promote equality, diversity, and inclusion, the old trio. Swearing allegiance to the D.E.I totem became a condition for practicing law. Problem is, the D.E.I doctrine, because it favors certain groups of population, is simply contradictory to the principle of equality before the law. So what happened then? Some practitioners sounded the alarm, but of course most busy lawyers did sign the statement of principle to avoid trouble. As the next election of the members of the Law Society was coming up, those determined to repeal the untenable requirement ran a slate of candidates, and the result was dazzling. All of the 22 rebel candidates were elected with top votes, and the newly elected Law Society, of course, cancelled the statement of principle. As one of the lawyers who led the revolt wrote, I quote, "Despite all the bullying and name-calling, there was really nothing of substance on the other side. They didn't have the arguments to convince people of the merits of their position except through pressure to conform. What happens when you stand up to them? Nothing," she says. And then she adds, "We found our courage and we discovered that courage is contagious," which I think is a nice statement. One last lesson is that when institutions are too infiltrated by wokeism, instead of struggling to reform them, you might as well build new ones. Some academics decided to start from scratch and founded the University of Austin, Texas, a university dedicated to free thought, critical thinking, and open debate. No more safe spaces, no more trigger warnings, and of course, no DEI departments. Their summer program is called Forbidden Courses, which is telling. The first cohort of bachelor's students arrives in this next fall, in fall 2024. The project was announced in November 2021, and within 2 years, it has raised $200 million. 𝐢𝐿𝐴𝐻, this new university, embodies a rebirth of higher education, whereby reason overcomes dogma. To be clear, it does nothing else than reviving the pluralism. In conclusion, I will say that witnessing a change of model, because Wokism has managed to infiltrate universities, trade unions, schools, businesses, and even churches, new structures are now emerging dedicated to foundational values. Maybe MCC is one of them. To quote the famous saying from 𝐥𝐿𝐵 movie The Leopard, if we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change. Sounds a bit better in French, I will say it in French. Il faut que tout change pour que rien ne change. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvie. Bill, would you like to respond to Sylvie? Would you be so optimistic about the fight back and the methods and the tools, or would you pose some difficult questions or maybe criticize the approach?
No, not at all. I mean, the first thing to say is, I want to completely congratulate Sylvie for having put together this chronicle, actually. I think it's well worth everybody here's while. Whilst I'm familiar with many of the examples that you cite, there are always others that I just found flabbergasting, like the pursuit in natural history museums, for example, to uncover the fact that more animal artifacts are male than female, and that this was a sign of the inequality of science. You just think, what world, what planet are we living in? So just for that hilarity alone, I'm very grateful. Obviously, I have to preface all of my remarks by stating the obvious, which is that I am a white, cis, heterosexual, middle-aged, middle-class man, and that necessarily impinges on everything I'm going to say for the kind of deconstructionists amongst you. I think, let's start at the beginning. I think the important thing to understand is that woke exploits people's positive sentiments that they want to see the end of racism and sexism. It builds on that, and it's an entirely laudable social mood, but in the process, it turns everything around and transforms everything. It introduces, as Sylvie has identified, a new language whereby to be anti-racist today means to celebrate racial difference and leads to the demand in American university campuses for racially segregated dormitories, which to anyone of my age would be seen as a form of apartheid, and is quite the opposite of the Martin Luther King "I have a dream" of unifying people. So first of all, it turns that around, and then it just goes completely off the rails. I mean, obviously there's that element where it denies its very existence, despite having introduced the term in a very explicit way, particularly in the early years of this century. And then it politicizes every aspect of life. There's nothing you can do or say that can't be deconstructed through the prism of woke. So to give you crazy examples, you're not allowed, for instance, in Canada, which I used to teach in British Columbia, and you're right to point out, one of the wokest places on the planet, you're not allowed to call homeless people, because the claim is that defines them by their homelessness. And so you now have to say people suffering from homelessness. And then, of course, if you were to go to a homeless person and say, does this new definition help alleviate your suffering? Of course not. It does nothing. So it's this, what's important to understand about woke also is that it's a performative gesture politics. Yeah, it focuses on the performance and does little to address the underlying inequalities and challenges. And you can't get a better example than the one Sylvie gave about Claudine Gay and the Harvard University saga. I mean, Claudine Gay went out of her way when she was Dean of Humanities at Harvard to hound out Roland Fryer. Roland Fryer is a black academic who won a MacArthur Genius Award at the age of 30, which was unheard of. But his research went against the dominant woke narrative of black people suffering at the hands of the police in the United States of America. And he discovered, much to his own consternation, that actually if you're white, you're far more likely to be killed by the police in the United States than if you're black. And because of that, she made a point of trying to rescind his tenure, which had never been done within Harvard. Now, since she herself has lost her job as president of Harvard, she has played the woke identity card by saying, well, it's because I'm the first black woman to be the president of Harvard. And it just shows you that ordinary people can't accept that someone like myself from a Haitian immigrant background can reach the pinnacles of American academia. Now, we all know that Haiti is one of the poorest Caribbean islands, one of the poorest places on the planet. But Claudine Gay comes from one of the wealthiest families in Haiti. You know, her ancestors run the concrete industry in Haiti. Yeah, so, and she went to a $50,000 a year private school before then going on to Princeton and Stanford. In other words, she plays on her colour in order to avoid discussion about her class privilege. And so you get this constant competition, and the politicisation of, like I said, everything is ludicrous. Well, I have to say I'm less optimistic than Sylvie. And the reason for my lack of optimism is because despite all of the examples that Sylvie chronicles in her book, the very fact that I'm familiar with most of those examples tells me that this is not a worldwide societal riposte. I'm familiar with the individuals, I'm familiar with the cases, and you know, the person you cite who probably the majority of the people in this room would have heard of is someone like Jordan Peterson. But if I go to an ordinary person on the street in London and I say, do you know who Jordan Peterson is? They'll probably answer, who does he play for? But so they don't know who these people are. They don't know that there is this riposte, but they do suffer the consequences of woke. Yeah, because if a child in a school in London says that another child who wants to be identified as a cat suggests that that child is mad, then the child who said that will be taken in for re-educating about the need to accept the identity that individuals assign to themselves. And that is a real example. So, you know, I'm not, you know, giving you crazy examples. There are crazier examples. There's a whole discussion online about a figure called Knuckles, who I don't know if you know. Knuckles is a cartoon echidna in the Sonic the Hedgehog cartoon series. And because one individual suggested that maybe he was falsely portraying white male characteristics, that person was slapped down in the online discussion forum because apparently Knuckles was programmed as a black cartoon character. And you kind of think, this is obscurantist craziness, you know, that most people want nothing to do with. And of course, it does nothing to resolve any gender, racial and gender inequalities that remain in society. Very last point, what do we need to go forwards? Well, I think, you know, the reason I'm less optimistic is we need moral courage. And I don't think that we live in an age when there are great manifestations of people coming together to express their rejection of this. You know as well as I do that whenever you talk to anyone about these issues, about, you know, trans identity or whatever, they will privately say, yeah, Bill, I know, it's all crazy, isn't it? And you're kind of thinking, well, why don't you have the courage to say that out loud? You know, when there was the American swimming trials, which were all won by a male athlete who identifies as the female Leah Thomas, there was only one person in the whole of the swimming auditorium who stood up in the medal ceremony at the end and shouted out, "He's a man, he's a man."
Yeah.
And then that person, Posey Parker, who is an activist, received lots of Twitter support from people saying, "I was in the auditorium, I'm so glad you said that." And you're kind of thinking, well, why didn't you have the courage to say it too? Because once 2 people start saying it, and then 4 people, and then 8, you can begin to turn these things around. And I do fear that our lack of moral courage is the biggest hurdle.
Actually, you know that Sharon Davis, who used to be a swimmer,
Yeah.
Olympic swimmer, she's doing this campaign because, you know, the legislative elections are coming up in 1 year, I think, in Great Britain. So what she will do is she will go to each candidate and ask them the definition of a woman, and she'll post the videos, so then you know who you're voting for, and if they're agreed to defend women's rights. I think one after the other, you know, the people who have courage bring behind them other people. That's where I don't agree with you, but and also because it is. You said it's. Some people don't even know the word Wokism, but they know what transgenderism is. They've heard about systemic racism, about white guilt. They've heard all this, so they know how it manifests, and it has some authoritarian aspect to it. So it's becoming to come into their private life. Also because Wokism wants to take care of everything. I mean, they're talking about period poverty. So, you know, they're taking care of every aspect of your private life. So people, I think, at one point,
I think we should be careful not to play their game. You know, it's like, you know, if Sharon Davis is going to go around saying to every candidate, do you know what a woman is? It might also put people off. I mean, I think it's important that mainstream society has a sense of what it wants to achieve and say, look, you know, like you say, let's put all this behind us and focus on what we want to do. So we need to be careful not to be sucked into the debate on the terms in which the debate has been set.
And most of the people from the counteroffensive, after a few years, they want to go back to, you know, real things, to beauty, to you know, study interesting texts, and stop doing this war that they're being drawn in.
But I think, where I'll finish, I think, one last point. I think the real point that's important that you make, Sylvie, is that ultimately it's democracy that can change things. When people are given a chance to vote about this, they always vote against it. Yeah, it needs to be put to some extent it needs to be put to people. It needs to be put on the ballot. I trust ordinary people. It's like I hear your point about there's all these clever people who've pushed back against it, but ultimately it's large numbers of people that we need. You know, J.K. Rowling has pushed back, but we're not all multimillionaires like J.K. Rowling. We're not all people who don't care if we come under attack and lose our job, because we do care.
Let's give the people from the floor.
I just wanted to make a remark about Claudine Gay. Clearly a bad scientist, but the only reason why they looked into her bad science and academic record is for political reasons. Nobody was interested in her record before the conflict blew up. She plagiarized, I mean, that is a fact. And this is also unfortunate because I'm certain that there are many more bad scientists in Harvard and other universities hosting them. I wonder when these people would be dug out for the right reasons, because they're doing bad science and bad research instead of just for their political views.
We know that a lot of ideologies are actually funded by money and serve money. Example is Arabo Islamism, which which is funded by petrol and serves petrol industry. Genders, change, etc., is big pharma and vice versa. Now, what is about this story? Who is behind it? Where's the money?
Okay, so I like your analogy about woke being like a virus, that it dies naturally, it gets weaker with time and then it dies. So if it's the case, why do we have to fight against it? Doesn't it make us look a little bit desperate?
My question is if you could expand on what is the ultimate objective of Wokism and who is actually behind, because I do not believe that this is a natural expression of a spontaneous of people. They have been channeled into this type of movement, and they are being exploited for the wrong reasons. So if you could expand on that, I would appreciate it. Thanks.
I think the few questions kind of merged because it was about the money behind it and who stands behind it, like politically or maybe ideologically, and also whether we should fight it or it's just like a natural disease that just passes through. Why is it important to fight back?
The ultimate aim you're asking, I think it's anti-capitalism and anti-Western ideology. It has garbs of many things, but the core idea, I think, is this. Actually, there was a book of an MEP, we're in Brussels, so, of 𝐤𝐲𝐤𝐞 𝐏𝐿. It is called The Devil in Democracy, and it shows how all the communist way of using language, of intimidating people, has been reproduced by Wokism. And you're asking how it became so strong. There are now two theories about that. One theory is that it all goes back to the Civil Rights Act, which created a bureaucracy in order to protect minorities. And the Civil Rights Act was strengthened it started in the 60s, it was strengthened in the 90s, and the bureaucracies grew. They become very strong and numerous, and now it's difficult to go back, I think.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm going to address this gentleman over here. I do think the follow the money narrative is ultimately a very weak one. Not everything in life is about follow the money, and that brings me to the last gentleman who asked the question, which is, who does it benefit? I think ultimately what it is a mechanism for a directionless and purposeless ruling elite to provide identity and affirm their purpose and coherence in an age where they've lost all their coherence and purpose. I mean, really, since the end of the Cold War and we saw the end of the political left and the political right, the establishment has been lost in terms of its purpose. Anti-communism is, 40 years old now. So what can you use to bring people together? Well, you've got this new language. And it's actually the one French philosopher, strangely, that I thought was most missing in Sylvie's book is Bourdieu. Because Bourdieu wrote a book called La Distinction, or Distinctions, where he looks at mechanisms for ruling establishments to use cultural ways of self-identifying with one another, whether that be the university they went to or language codes that they use. When you don't use one of their language codes, they know you're not one of them. And so that's ultimately who it serves. I'll just finish on one quick point on the virus thing. I mean, I do think we all need to be careful not to use biological metaphors when analysing social science. The reason, Christina, you like the virus analogy is because you like the conclusion that it leads to, not because the virus analogy is particularly useful or insightful. Everybody does it. Everybody says, "Oh, this is like a virus. This spreads. We need to," And I do think, look, we need to analyse things in their own terms rather than using these metaphors that can actually be counterproductive.
Thank you for also correcting me, Frank.
Can I just speak without a microphone?
No.
All right, so is it okay to disagree a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah? So I think there are 2 points. I think people misinterpret the drivers of woke because they often imagine that it comes from radical activists on campuses. They imagine that it comes from below, in a sense, these small groups of individuals who somehow march to the academy. I think that from my analysis, as I wrote in one of my books, it comes from above. And it's precisely because the ideology, almost every single dimension, from transgenderism to intersectionality, because it comes from because the establishment has internalized it. If you read the Harvard Business Review, it reads like a sociology journal. And these business magazines are the ones that corporations that run the corporations actually read. So I think that in many respects, it's precisely because within for example, the civil service in Britain, because of the big universities in America, because of the corporations, the people that run them are the ones that are most wholeheartedly committed to it. That's become so powerful because they are in a position to set up these departments that you talked about in universities, and they just mushroom all of a sudden. I mean, it's not necessarily a virus, but it looks like a virus. But actually, the reason what's happening is that they got the money, they got the power to alter these institutions in their image completely. And I think it's important not to underestimate that the Anglo-American establishment is kind of united by, in a sense, internalizing this ideology. The second thing is, I think that Rufo and the other guy are going to lose their bet. And I think the reason why they're going to lose their bet is because we are in the beginning, the early stage of Wokism. I mean, it's very good that we're fighting back against it, and the examples you said are really excellent. But you have to remember that where this kind of ideology is most dangerous and most powerful is among young people, amongst children. If you look at what the schools are teaching our children, not just now, but for like 4 generations, if you look at the way that young people think, not the old people, but the way the young people think, if you look at the difference between the way young people react to the question, what is a woman, we think it's a stupid question, as opposed to the older people, you'll find that actually there is a ferment afoot which you cannot get rid of by using lawyers, and you cannot get rid of by using institutional means, because it's a cultural, powerful force. So for me, I think that, and the reason why I'm saying is not to give up, or not to say that this is inevitable or to be fatalistic, but I do think we have to concentrate, focusing on precisely those areas where Wokism is still growing rather than diminishing. It's the schools, it's the youth, it's youth culture, it's music, it's all these things that are, that are very, very powerful in our society. And you can tell that Wokism is more powerful than ever before by the way in which they've been able to silence criticism of Hamas. I mean, when you think about it, right, here you have an example of October the 7th, and throughout the Anglo-American world, people are scared to basically say what they really know, what they actually see. I mean, the censorship, the self-censorship, I've never seen anything like it in my life. It can only occur when there is something, in the air that forces people to become scared and to conform to something that exists there. So when you go back to France, or if you ever do go back to France, I think it's quite important to understand that this is coming to France, it's coming everywhere, even to East Europe, it's coming. And we've got to be strong enough to have the weapons. And the most important point I think that you were saying and you were making is the importance of individuals standing up and being counted in relation to that. I think that's why your book is so important, because when you write a book like this, it kind of sparks up a discussion about something that people don't debate anymore. People either say, I know what Wokism is, or I don't care about it.
Right.
Yes. I have a request to Sylvie. You're French. There will be the Olympic Games in France.
Yeah.
we are 27 countries in the European Union. I have the following request, that you are distributing 2 times medals, gold, silver and bronze, for the EU country which has the most resistance to Wokism, and then 3 other gold, silver and bronze medal to the country where Wokism is the most established already. And in case, I don't know, Bill is very sporty, but yeah, might be, he might.
He's also French.
Oh, apologies. Then you might answer as well. And there might be differences in your analysis. The 3 countries like this. Thank you.
In Europe.
European Union, yeah.
There's
European
a
Union.
in the year?
To whom?
I would like to talk a bit about demography also. Woke, it's so depressing ideology. Wokist, I think he's very depressed. And depressed people, they don't have children. Also, trans people, biologically, it's already difficult to have children. And if we listen to them, there are, for instance, there was a famous we're here, we're queer, we're coming for our children scan during a manifestation. So what they are doing, in fact, is somewhere they know they don't, their demography is not very well for them, so they are coming for our children. So what do you think about that? How? And in fact, in America, there's a big movement of parents
Yes,
against
in France too.
Against that evolution. I think it's that's also an important way to tackle this movement. Thank you.
And one more question.
Thank you very much. I tend to share a bit the pessimism or realism of Frank, up to you to choose, because it's all about manipulation of the mind. And what I want to ask is, can we get rid of Wokism without getting rid of gender ideology, which states that there's no such thing as a biologically defined sex, that it's something that you can choose, that you can change, go back and forth. Gender ideology is everywhere. It's all written in the documents of the European Union now, in business, as you referred to them in the beginning. If that remains, and if that spreads amongst the youth, can we at all get rid of Wokism? Is it really happening?
No, just to answer to the question of having children or not having children, I think it's interesting because I think Wokism is bleak. You know, you repudiate your ancestors because the history is only racism, colonialism, and imperialism and slavery. So those are, you repudiate your ancestors, you repudiate your parents because they ruined the planet. You remember Greta Thunberg saying, "How dare you?" in front of the leaders of the world, screaming. You repudiate yourself because you don't accept your own chromosomes, your own biology, and you don't have children because you consider that it's more pollution for the planet if you have children. So I don't agree with Frank because I think young people, they have blood going into their body, they're lively, and I don't think all young people kowtow to this ideology. I think young people, they want to have fun, they want to have sex, they want to meet people, and they cannot adhere to such a bleak ideology. That's what I think.
Although apparently they're having less sex than
yeah, you're right.
the generation before. But anyway, let's leave that to one side. Where was I going? Sorry. Well, aside from the kind of humour in the point about the medal ceremonies in the Olympics in France, I think there's an important point in what you raise and Balázs touches on too, which is that woke has migrated out of its domestic context to becoming a form of international relations as well. You know, when the Biden administration basically dictates that countries that don't adhere to new American values, by which he means gender recognition, critical race theory, then those countries will be treated as pariahs. I mean, it becomes a mechanism for disciplining not just people at home, but people internationally too. It'd be interesting to see if there's a pushback on that front. I'm afraid, I mean, I don't know if we want to dissolve the discussion into are you an optimist, a pessimist, is the glass half full, is it half empty type of discussion. But I do think, we should get away from the extreme examples of, transgender people not being able to have children, to the recognition of what Frank is pointing to, which is they've already turned your children against you. This is a cultural revolution on a scale we haven't seen since the Chinese one, and we know where that ended up. It is a question whereby, I know a very good friend of mine, her husband hasn't been able to speak to his children ever since the Gender Recognition Act, because the children just think he's mad to say what's wrong with people identifying as whoever they want to be. What's wrong with that? And so it's dividing families, it's creating a generational conflict. And of course, who does that benefit? Well, the powers that be benefit from a society that's broken up into a series of conflicting minority groups. They themselves sense themselves to be a minority under challenge. No surprise they celebrate minority rights. But what it does is if we allow it to atomize the rest of us, to prevent us from presenting a unifying agenda, that's when it becomes a real problem. In any other world, people who came to you and said, we don't like your traditions and we don't like the language that you use and you need to adopt this language, would be seen for what they are, which is imperialists. Yeah. But they're not being called out.
I just want to say that things evolve very quickly regarding Wokism. I've been working 4 years on that. When I started, the word Wokism wasn't used in France. Now it's used all over. And so to combat Wokism, you need first to spot it, then to understand how it works, and then to invent some tools. And I think we're now in a stage where we've passed this sequence of just spotting it. Everybody here has heard about everything we're talking about. So it's changing. That's why I'm a bit more optimistic. It's because it's really evolving. We're not stuck into, because it was that's why I wrote this book. I thought it was so sad to see institutions, pluricentenarian institutions, destroyed. Everything that works, that's beautiful, destroyed, broken, and it is changing, I would think.
But you'd have to dismantle human relations departments, you'd have to untangle the think tank industrial complex.
There was an article on the CNBC recently that in the tech companies in America, they're scratching their D.E.I budgets on as much as 90%. Things we have good news.
Let's have a few more questions.
My question: what are the countries most vote and most fighting?
We will discuss it over wine later. Can we agree on that?
No, but
yes,
yes, we can agree. Move.
I would have, with our microphone, I have a loud voice. I would have another question. If you could tell us about. Sorry. I would have like to ask another question. How much Wokism do we have outside North America and the European Union? And why?
And one more question. At the front.
But I have to say that he raised his hand before me.
Thank you very much.
And he's my student.
Hello, Bill. So you say that woke puts in danger pluralism and freedom of speech. But so what does the counteroffensive do to take this danger away from pluralism and freedom of speech? aren't there risks that if you focus too much on anti-wokeism rather than focusing on pluralism and freedom of speech? You said another word as well, apart from plural, I can't remember.
Equality before the law, or
possibly.
objective truth.
Possibly. So isn't there a danger that you focus too much on anti-wokeism rather than focusing on the issues?
I'm not sure I understand your question, sorry. You mean,
can you rephrase
well, so
it?
okay, so if wokeism is a danger to pluralism and freedom of speech, as you said, then how is a counteroffensive being useful to that? Can you explain that?
Well, for example, they passed a law in the UK. There was a law on freedom of speech. Sorry.
One more question here at the front. Picking up a few questions at the time.
No, sure. Sorry. Sorry.
Okay, 16 years ago, there was a story about sexual education in schools. We had tender in Croatia, 2 programs, one progressive one, which was promoted by media as scientific and so on, promoted homosexuality and everything. And our program, which was attacked in all media radically because we spoke about some values. And finally, when we entered schools, parental meetings, our teacher, their teacher, half an hour each. After that, 89% of parents have chosen our program. So what I want to say about the Frank's pessimism, so it is concerning tools they have. I think media, politicians, NGO sector, business sector and so on. So I wouldn't be that optimistic, but still I think that there is some kind of, let's say, natural law which all people recognize in themselves. For people in Croatia, for most of them, they don't know about it. They are addicted, of course, to this media and to all this, and of course they will go for a certain part of this path with them. But on the other hand, they think that it is something strange there, you know. So maybe that is description what they think about it. It is something strange there, and concerning this optimism and pessimism for how long it will last, I agree that it will finally, as any other ideology, will bankrupt, so to say, because it is not in line with this natural law. But this is my just.
Shall we just have final responses and remarks from you before we
finish?
First?
Yeah. Well, just on the pessimism bit. Look, just because I say I'm delighted to meet you doesn't mean I'm delighted to meet you. And so the same way, just because somebody says that they're going to oppose woke, doesn't mean that they then take the necessary steps to put that into practice. Boris Johnson claimed he was going to oppose woke. Kemi Badenoch, when she was the education minister, said that critical race theory had no place being taught in a British school without balancing ideas, and that it was against the law. And British schools just went ahead and ignored her. You know, which begs an important question, which is who rules in a woke age? If government ministers can make announcements, if Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, can introduce new gender guidance for British schools that are being, elided through the actions of British teachers, who's in control here? That's an important question. So I think just because, even if the Democrats officially say that they're turning their back on woke and Peter Boghossian wins his bet, doesn't mean that anything of the sort has happened. So I think you actually need to, we all know that politics is about more than words. It's about actions. And therefore, keep your eye on what's actually happening. To the gentleman who asked where does this exist outside of, the American and European context, I know this is the European context, but I just thought I'd bring it home to Sylvie. Woke is alive and well in France. There's l'affaire Gérard Depardieu is ongoing at the moment. It's a kind of Me Too throwback about what did Gérard do with young actresses. And Macron has had to step in and say, maybe it's wrong to put him on trial before he's been on trial. But all of it now, of course, none of us here wants, people who abuse women to be around and continuing, professionally. But it just shows you how deeply ingrained it is. And if you want to see how deeply ingrained it is in France, you just have to look at those demonstrations, you know, pro-Palestine and the kind of anti-Semitic level amongst young people in France. I think it's quite horrific, and it just shows you the extent to which a narrative of oppression, of celebrating perceived victims over moral right, has become, you know, ingrained. Very last thing I want to make, the only bit that gives me optimism is ordinary people. Whenever ordinary people are given a chance to voice their opinion in relation to this, they do vote against it. But that means more than ever before, we need to be arguing the case for democracy in every aspect of our lives. Real democracy, not democracy by committees of experts with, you know, or even people's parliaments that are advised by experts. Real democracy, because when people are given a chance, they know what a woman is.
Sylvie?
Yes, Eric Kaufman, the politics teacher, you know, he says it really will be an issue that will divide the politics in liberal democracies in the years to come, because it's really two worldviews. But one thing we haven't mentioned is the media, the information, because I think most of the people don't have time to look for information and to look for news and to know exactly what's happening. And I think the media are very responsible of the state of affairs. I don't know who you mean when you say from above, Frank. I don't know. Is it the open society? Is it the president? Is it God? I don't know who is above. But I think the media is very much responsible. Just to answer your question about pluralism, I think the problem in university is the lack of pluralism. And then you can fight for free speech, but the good thing would be to have more pluralism within universities. There was this saying of an American in an American op-ed that was describing American higher education, and it says it's left-wing students who are taught by teachers who are more left-wing, and the administration is far left. That's the way. Sorry, my English is poor, but that's the way the higher education, the American higher education, how much it is pluralistic. And there was this law in the UK, the freedom of speech law, education law. You don't believe in this neither? You don't believe
I
in
believe
that?
it in principle.
Yeah. No, I think it will help. It's paradoxical to force people to be free. It's a bit complicated, but apparently it does help on site that this law requires from state universities and from student unions to respect freedom of speech. And the guy who's in charge of this, Arif Ahmed, who's a very interesting guy. He's from Pakistani ascendance. He is a specialist of Wittgenstein. He's very libertarian, very attached to liberties, and I think he probably will do a good job because he already did one in Cambridge. You probably saw he did this campaign about the speech code in Cambridge, and so he is courageous. I think every kind of act, and from wherever it comes, because some come from the left or from the right, conservatives, liberal, they should all work together.
Bill has begged me for a few sentences
No,
more,
just
but
one.
it would be only if it's going to make us courageous, brave, and ready to fight. No pessimism.
I did find it amusing that Sylvie had to identify Arif by his ethnic background. What was that? No, it was on the media. I mean, there's one thing that, you know, that anyone who's been in England in the last few days will know that the #1 television broadcast is a series called Mrs. Bates versus the Post Office. And it's about a scandal that most people are completely uninterested in, whereby post office workers were falsely accused by the government of embezzling funds because their computer system wasn't working. It's about ordinary people in small towns that you've never heard of, and it's become a phenomenon. You know, like 4 million people watched it when it was mainstreamed, twice what the BBC gets as viewing figures. Why? I suspect because there are no woke figures in it. There's no affirmative action, lesbian, transgender, black faces. I mean, there are black faces because many of the sub-postmasters were black, but it's basically allowing the audience to use their own intelligence rather than having a narrative imposed upon them through film, which we've all become familiar with all of the recent Disney remakes. So there are positive things the media can do, and I think fantastic journalism, like Sylvie did for her book, is one of those.
Excellent. And before I invite all of you for a glass of wine and further discussion, and obviously being more on the points of action than just talk, we have a small number of Sylvie's books in French, and we are unable to sell them, but if you are interested, please see Tony at the back. Tony, can you wave? Sylvie would be very happy to sign, and I'm aware that some of you brought your own copies, so please do get them signed. Also, I wanted to ask you to subscribe to our Substack, and especially in relation to Freedom Freaks. We just released the new Substack today, and the areas we will be focusing on this year, 6 of them. But I think